Everyone learns in school that the Catholic Church was the big enemy of science. Well, you know who doesn't believe that anymore? Professional historians of science. Join me today on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization, and we'll learn the truth. Welcome to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. It comes as a surprise, doesn't it, to learn that the Catholic Church may have had a positive role in the development of science, right? Because we're all taught from birth the exact opposite. In school, in the media, in movies, scientists are always brave martyrs against the ignorant church that wants to suppress their findings. Well, you might be excused for this view if you lived 100 years ago, because then the dominant book on the subject was written by a fellow named Andrew Dickson White. I mentioned him in our first program because he wrote a book called A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. This became the defining volume on this subject. But it is full of nonsense. In fact, it turns out that in White's book, you actually read that the Catholic Church taught that the earth was flat. Now, we saw last time there is not the tiniest stitch of evidence for that. But White, anxious to portray the church as silly and backward and ridiculous, simply repeated what other historians had said without bothering to investigate it. That was the quality of his book. Since then, White's book has been so dramatically overturned that you'd think we'd be reading something about it. We'd hear, hey, the Catholic Church, after all, played an important role in the sciences, but instead, we hear only crickets. There's no real anxiety, there's no anxiousness to get to the truth in this matter. I wonder why that is. Well, there are a lot of modern historians who, unlike Professor White, are still alive and who are doing work right now and who have concluded that, in fact, the Church has played at least some kind of positive role, and some scholars even go so far as to say that the Church had certain ideas that were indispensable to the development of science. Well, that's the opposite of what we hear, right? But you have scholars saying this all the time. Thomas Goldstein, Toby Huff, A.C. Crombie, Edward Grant, David Lindbergh, Professor Heilbronn at Berkeley, and many others. So what are they saying? And how dare they say this? Don't they know the Catholic Church is nothing but an oppressor of the geniuses of the world? Well, let's look at some of the claims that these new historians are making. And by the way, they are not all Catholic. Some are Catholic, some aren't Catholic. I've deliberately gone out of my way to consult historians of science who are non-Catholic, some of whom are even anti-Catholic, in order to show that this is for real. This isn't a bunch of Catholics writing some books to make the Church look good. This is the consensus among professionals today. Now, one of the most important principles that the Catholic Church contributed to the development of science comes from a biblical verse that was one of the most frequently quoted in the whole Middle Ages. And that verse is Wisdom 11:21. And that verse tells us that God has ordered all things according to measure, number, and weight. Okay, so that doesn't sound explosive right off the bat, but I promise you it is. God has ordered all things according to measure, number, and weight. What did people take that to mean? They took it to mean that the universe God has created is orderly. It makes sense. It's intelligible to our minds. It's mathematical. It's ordered according to patterns, measure, number, weight. There is something mathematical about the universe. St. Augustine, for example, said God is like a great geometer. He's a great practitioner of geometry. So for anybody watching who hated geometry, hated math, well, St. Augustine is implicitly rebuking you, because in fact mathematics is really a language that God uses in ordering and fashioning this universe that He's given us. So the Christian tradition, through this wisdom verse that was quoted all through the Middle Ages, dramatically amplifies an existing tradition in the West, going back to the 6th century B.C., and the great pre-Socratic philosopher and mathematician Pythagoras. In the 6th century B.C., Pythagoras had said, You know what the universe is made of? It's not made out of air or water or earth, as some of his contemporaries had said. It's made out of numbers. That's the fundamental constituent of our universe. Not physical stuff, but numbers, math. Math is everywhere. And this Christian tradition, building on Wisdom 11:21, took Pythagoras' obscure insight and in effect developed a whole civilization around it. That's pretty important. And in fact, even scientists who may not have given the matter a second thought lived in a civilization in which the orderliness of the world was taken for granted. So, for example, let's consider the gentleman who drew up for us the first periodic table of the elements, Dmitri Mendeleev. He so believed that the universe was orderly that when he began arranging the elements, and perhaps you've seen the periodic table of the elements, got all the constituent parts of our world, and they're listed according in rows, and then a series of rows creates columns, and he found that elements that were next to each other on the table possessed similar characteristics. Well, then he got to about element number 21, and there was a gap there. He couldn't find an element that should fit there. But he said, the relationships keep working if I skip number 21 and I keep going. But so convinced was he that something had to go there. So convinced was he that God couldn't have given us this universe, or that he couldn't believe we could live in a universe where there'd be a big gap on the periodic table. There had to be something that belonged there. So he predicted, well, someday we'll discover an element that goes there. I mean, what nerve the guy has to say, of course we'll find something to fit into the gap on my chart. But sure enough, what did they find? 10 years later, the element scandium was discovered. Where does it go? It's atomic number 21. So this is a key feature of our civilization. And in fact, the scientific method cannot be pursued unless you believe the universe is orderly. Because what do you do in the scientific method? What's it all about? The scientific method consists of gathering data about the world around you, and then studying that data, looking for patterns, trying to understand it, and then developing hypotheses about the data. Why do I think thus and so is occurring? And then devising experiments to then confirm or disconfirm my various hypotheses. Now, you cannot follow those steps unless you believe the universe is orderly. Because I have to be sure, I have to have a confidence that if I run the same experiment multiple times under the same conditions, I will get the same results. Now, if I live in a disorderly universe, I have no right to expect that. Maybe 6 times when I drop something, it will fall to the ground, but maybe the 7th time, the object will turn into Elvis. How do I know? If I don't live in an orderly universe, I have no right to expect that. And if I don't live in an orderly universe, I can't even begin to do science. I can't even begin to find patterns in the universe if I don't expect them to be there. This is essential for science. And in fact, Albert Einstein even said, it's a miracle that the universe is orderly. We have absolutely no right to assume that. And in fact, many civilizations did not assume it. They did not assume it. Ancient Babylon, for example, the Babylonians did not assume the universe was orderly. It was completely chaotic. Did science get started among the ancient Babylonians? The question answers itself, doesn't it? So these are essential points. These are essential points that the universe is orderly and mathematical. Now, that does not mean that the universe is so orderly that God can't perform miracles, that would somehow violate the order of the universe. Of course, as Catholics, we believe in miracles. God can perform miracles. Of course we believe that. But understand what that means. You can only recognize a miracle if it takes place against a backdrop of order. If we lived in a completely chaotic universe, how could we recognize a miracle? Everything would be a miracle. Everything's crazy and chaotic and doesn't follow any laws. So we recognize God's miracles because He performs them within a universe of order. St. Anselm very helpfully clarified this point. He said that God has His absolute power, or potentia absoluta for you Latinists, and His ordered power, or potentia ordinata. That is to say, sure, God has the raw power to turn that object into Elvis, but he also has his ordered power by which he behaves according to the laws that he's built into the universe, that it would not befit the dignity of our God for him to behave in such a whimsical way. He can't do that. He has to, in effect, behave in a way that is consistent with his promises to us. And in effect, the functioning of the universe is one of those promises. So we expect to find order in the universe, and that's why scientists go looking for it. But as I say, not all civilizations have been able to do this, have had this insight. We take this insight for granted. The universe makes sense, we can find mathematical relationships in it, but not every civilization could. And one civilization that could not is Islamic civilization. Now, there's much we can say about Islamic contributions to civilization and even the sciences. For example, in some of what we might call the applied sciences, like medicine and optics. Well, Muslims made great contributions in those areas. But in the more theoretical sciences, Islamic science, in effect, suffered what Father Stanley Yaki calls a stillbirth. It seemed like it was going somewhere, and then boom, gone. And then today, of course, Islamic civilization is largely a backwater, scientifically. Now, why is that? Why did Islam suffer such devastation in terms of the sciences? One reason involves this matter of the ability to view the universe as being orderly. Islamic civilization could not do that. Because if you were to say that the universe is ordered according to certain laws that must be observed, that would be an insult to Allah, who may behave as arbitrarily as he wants. What looks like a law to you may just be one of his habits that he can discontinue at any time. Well, we got a break now, but come on back for some more myth-busting about the church and science.